Well, good evening, fellow Polonians and friends, and welcome to our webinar. I'm Dr. Gene Sokolowski, and I'm POSSE EDU president. We are a 501c3 nonprofit educational organization, and our mission is to educate the American public accurately on key aspects of Polish and Polish-American history, culture, and relevant current events. Our guest this evening is Mr. Jan Peczkis, whom many of you know for his insightful analyses of over 1,800 works. Let me repeat that, 1,800 works by Jewish and non-Jewish authors on historical as well as contemporary Polish-Jewish interrelations. Jan's analyses of the Holocaust literature in particular reveals significant falsifications, misrepresentations, and material omissions about Poland and the Poles, which largely explains why Polish-Jewish relations remain problematic. So Jan, welcome, and we thank you for being our speaker this evening.
Thanks. My pleasure. Today we're going to talk about how the Holocaust obscures Polish suffering, which I call a Polokaust. I'll go into some detail into that.
Okay, sounds great. Yeah, and I'm going to, for the benefit of our viewers, I'm just going to instruct how we're going to proceed. We'll start with the cover slide of Jan's presentation. I'll bring that up momentarily. Let me just do that, and we'll get to that right away. And I'm going to make a full screen on that.
There we go.
There you go. So here you see the URLs for Jan's two excellent websites. These URLs were also included in our webinar invitation with instructions on how you can review his many outstanding analyses and findings. So our procedure for tonight will be, we'll present Jan's slide. Secondly, while he is presenting or while his slide is shown, then I will ask one or more questions for that slide, and then Jan, of course, will discuss in detail the information on that slide. So with that, we'll go ahead and transition to the, I'll get the, I have to apologize. I think I mislaid the questions. Here we go. So let's proceed now to the first slide. Now, Jan, as Americans, we view genocide as the ultimate form of evil, the ultimate racist evil. And in our public schools and in universities, we are taught that the Holocaust is the only genocide of significance because it was Hitler's objective to eliminate all European Jews. This is in fact false. We also know that both Hitler and Stalin targeted Poles for genocide and committed genocide against them. So if you would please explain for us what Hitler's objective was in September 1939 when he attacked Poland, and what objective did he articulate for the Polish people, and did he express the same objective for Polish Jews?
Okay, thank you so much. All right, first of all, the first 8 years of Nazi German rule, 1933 to 1941, Hitler did not target Jews as a group. Individual atrocities, discrimination against Jews, but no attempt to exterminate the Jews. The extermination of the Jews was not decided by Hitler until sometime in 1941. That's 2 years after the war started, and it was in response to international Jewry allegedly making a world war out of the war that already was, by bringing the United States into the war. So the first 2 years of the war, 1939 to 1941, Hitler killed more Poles than he did Jews. Just before he invaded Poland, he plainly said, "Our warm aim does not consist in reaching certain lines, but in the physical destruction from the enemy." Right and then, off the bat, he said he was not just interested in destroying Poland as a nation state. He wasn't interested in destroying Polish culture. He wasn't interested in the physical destruction of the Poles. In fact, he made it even more explicit and unambiguous, with orders to them to send to death mercilessly and without compassion men, women, and children of Polish derivation and language. Now, some people try to weasel out of it by saying he was talking, it was just pep talk. He was talking about the destruction of the Polish army. He clearly was not. the Polish army does not consist of men, women, and children. He's talking about the intentional destruction of Polish civilians and in genocide. He talked about Lebensraum, vast Polish territories which would be settled by Germans and had to be cleared of Poles. That was the objective of the war. And then he said, who after all speaks today of the annihilation of the Armenians? So he knew he was going to do an act of genocide like the Turks did with the Armenians, and he figured that just as the Turks got away with doing genocide on the Armenians, so also he, Hitler, would get away with doing genocide on the Poles. And the objective was for Poland to be depopulated and settled by Germans. Okay, next.
Next slide.
Yes.
Now, we know
Okay.
that Nazism's Lebensraum, like what you had indicated, or living space in English, that ideology declared that new territory must be taken from the Slavs and then colonized with the German master race. We also know that Nazism's racial ideology declared that Slavs, Jews, and Roma were inferior races that must be exterminated and enslaved to prevent them intermixing with the German master race, because if they did so, they would contaminate it to the point of extinction. So with these ideologies as the main justification for attacking and occupying Poland, what were the Germans' strategies for exterminating the Poles?
Okay, during the occupation, they didn't have the manpower to do it. I'll get into that later. But they had long-term plans afterward. Generalplan Holocaust for the mass resettlement and extermination of tens of millions of Slavs. Details to be worked out. The Germans were also working on, did lots of experiments on people in concentration camps to develop ways to sterilize people without them knowing that they're sterilized. The idea was to make some Poles sit behind the desk, like to fill out a paper, something innocent. You would be sterilized without knowing it. Tens of millions of Poles and others could be sterilized and could never have offspring, and then they, within a generation, they would die out. Notice the deceptiveness, like Hitler built the gas chambers for the Jews to look like showers so that the Jews would think they were just going to take a shower, but they were gassed. So likewise, he used deception to make think a Polish doing something innocent, like sitting before a table and filling out a form while he was being sterilized. And as far as gas is concerned, poison gas, it was not just for Jews. The Germans had enough Zyklon cyanide gas stockpiled in the death camps Majdanek and Auschwitz to kill 20 million victims. So there was lots of different plans going around, the strategies to exterminate the Poles after the war. Next.
Now, on one of your big bulletin analyses that you have on your websites, this one is titled Polokaust and Holocaust were twins, not opposites. You point out that, quote, the Germans prioritized the murders of the Polish intelligentsia. It was clear genocidal intentionality, and for this reason, Polish inmates, that is to say, concentration camp inmates, had to keep secret the fact that they were doctors, lawyers, and etc. So the question then would be, did any top Nazis, other than Hitler, did they specify an intent to exterminate all Poles?
Yes, Heinrich Himmler said, later all Poles will disappear from the world. It is therefore necessary that the great German nation saw its main task in destructing all Poles. That's a pretty clear and unambiguous. Okay, next.
Now, here we know that the Holocaust narrative aggressively promotes the thesis of unique victim status. This claim of supreme suffering has become so deeply entrenched in the collective consciousness of the American public that Hitler's genocides of Poles and Roma remain virtually unknown. This narrative also deliberately omits key facts that invalidate the notion of unique victim status, such as Nazism's ideology of racial purity and Lebensraum, that also, of course, targeted Slavs and Roma. So what are some of the arguments used by the Holocaust supremacy camp to justify this thesis of unique victim
Mainly
status?
they are, mainly these are emotional arguments or things which were true of the Holocaust, but they were true of all genocides, or they were irrelevant specifically to the Jews, incidental. For example, Jews talk about all the German propaganda that was directed against the Jews. And when the Gypsies bring up their genocide, well, they say that there was hardly any Nazi propaganda against Gypsies. I mean, that's confusing two different things. The Gypsy genocide and one against the Poles took place without much propaganda because none was necessary. The Jews were a high-profile people. They were an international people, so they needed more propaganda to fight them as an enemy. The Poles and Gypsies less so, but the genocides were just the same with or without propaganda. Then Jews make a lot of the Wannsee Conference. Minutes have survived. January 1942, there was a conference that talked about a final solution to the Jewish problem of 11 million European Jews. And Jews keep telling us, well, there never was a Wannsee for Poles or Gypsies or anything. Again, that is total nonsense, because you do not need a Wannsee in order to do a genocide. A genocide is a genocide the way it's conducted. You don't need a written declaration or even a verbal declaration of genocide in order for there to be a genocide. It is simply done. Genocide is action, not words and thoughts. For example, the Germans killed 3 million Russian prisoners of war by starvation without any known Wannsee. It was genocide just the same. And same with millions of Poles and Gypsies without any Wannsee, but it was genocide just the same. Then Jews make a big deal about industrial genocide, about the gas chambers and the crematoria and all that. A couple of fallacies in that. First of all, the first 8 years of Nazi rule, the Nazis used to use gas chambers on the handicapped. They did not start using them on Jews until 8 years later. The whole works from the beginning, the handicapped, the fake shower heads, the crematoria, and all that. That began in 1933. The extermination of Jews in gas chambers did not begin until late 1941 in Chelmna, and on a full scale at Treblinka, Sobibor, at Belzec in 1940. And a further irony, more than half of the 6 million murdered Jews did not die in gas chambers. They were shot by Einsatzgruppen units on the Eastern Front. And in the recent Rwandan genocide, the genocide was conducted by clubs, clubbing people to death. You don't need any kind of technology to do a genocide, even a minimal technology like gas chambers. So all this talk about gas chambers is a lot of hoopla, just add glorification to the Jews' Holocaust, but has no basis, in fact, in that area. Now, Jews make a big deal of the fact that they were made into scapegoats. Of course, that is true of every genocide. If you are a genocidal power, you're going to do genocide against some group, you have to blame them for something. You have to convince enough people under your power that those people are a danger and they must be eliminated as a whole. So all genocide victims are scapegoats. Then there's power disparity. Jews talk about the huge power disparity that existed between the Nazis and the Jewish communities. That's true of all genocides. If there was no power disparity, there would have been no genocide. The intended target of genocide could fight back and prevent the genocide from taking place. So for a genocide to happen in the first place, there has to be a power disparity. Like in 1939, you had a huge power disparity between German military forces and Polish military forces, which enabled Germany to roll over Poland with ease and eventually murder millions of Poles and millions of Jews. Jews seek a moral high ground by the fact that they were a minority group. All this stuff about this rights of minorities. My goodness, the Gypsies and the Armenians are also a minority group. Hey, but they don't get any special recognition or special rights or special attention because of that. And it depends how you define minority group. Poles can also be thought of a minority group, as a minority group. Poles are less than 1% of the world's population, and they don't get any special attention or understanding or compassion because of that. Nowadays, Jews try to blunt the competitive aspects of the Holocaust supremacy by talking about multi-directional memory. It's basically how you can have dialogue between members of different genocides that they can share memories. Okay, that is a pure deflection and a distraction. Dialogue does not mean that the wrong has been changed. A master and a slave can have a sincere dialogue, but when it's all said and done, the master is still the master and the slave is still the slave. So there can be multi-directional memory, but when all is said and done, the Holocaust rules supreme and all other genocides are secondary and subordinate to it. Jews make a big deal about how they had been persecuted for centuries before the Holocaust. But that is true of other groups. Poles had also been persecuted for centuries before Hitler ever set foot and attacked Poland. Then you have a kind of a battle. Jews keep saying that the Holocaust is universal, has universal lessons. And for this reason, they kind of may have downplayed the Jewish specificity of the Holocaust. But now they're complaining just the opposite, that the Holocaust has been de-Judaized. That is, not enough emphasis on the Jewish specificity of the Holocaust. So they could kind of have it both ways. Or it can be, when the Holocaust was first being popularized, the Jews needed strategically to downplay its Jewish specificity, to let the Gentiles guard down and to make the Holocaust widespread. Kind of like the camel that got his nose under the tent, and when he gets his nose under the tent, then later the rest of the body can go through and get into the tent. Now that they're established, then they can now complain that it's the Judaism of the Holocaust has been downplayed, and it's time to ramp up the Jewish aspects of the Holocaust. That's the rest of the camel coming in to the tent. Then Jews do constant complaining that the world did nothing to stop the Holocaust. That's right. Guess what? The world did nothing to stop Poland's sufferings. The world did nothing to stop Katyn from happening. The world did nothing to stop the Cambodian genocide. Oh, that's what's a common thing. Jews always talk about bystanders, those that could have stopped the Holocaust but failed to do so. Well, you have to ask all the times the Jews could have done something for somebody in an hour of need but failed to do so. And we can talk about all the other genocides where there were bystanders that could have alleviated the genocide but failed to do so. Time and time again, we must keep talking about the Holocaust, so never again does the Holocaust happen. Well, do you suppose that Poles want Katyn to ever happen again? Or the Armenians want their genocide to ever happen again? Or the Gypsies want their genocide to happen again? Of course not, never again. So never again should mandate all genocides be taught equally, not just the Jews' Holocaust. The Jews also make a big emphasis of playing on emotions, for example, about Jewish children. Like they even have a ceremony where a Jewish boy going through a bar mitzvah gets paired up with the name of a boy who was murdered by the Germans and never got to do his bar mitzvah. Okay, so it plays on emotions. And of course, you play using children. Anne Frank, the Diary of Anne Frank. She's the poster girl of the Holocaust to enhance the Holocaust in the public imagination and appeal to children as victims. But of course, children were victims of every genocide. That's what makes genocide such a heinous crime, because it indiscriminately targets people just for who they were, and it deliberately kills children. So every genocide, you had killings of children. But of course, we never hear about them. All we hear about is the Jewish children, like Anne Frank. Okay, next.
So the Holocaust, again, with capital H, it serves as the patented trademark or brand that represents the supremacy of Jewish suffering at the hands of the Germans. And we heard previously the term Polokaust with a capital P, and one would think this term could, or indeed should, serve as the brand name for the genocide of Poles. However, it remains virtually unknown. What do you see are some of the dynamics at play here, and why the Holocaust has such brand power?
Okay, first of all, a lot of Poles think that Polish suffering is not well known because Poland was under the Iron Curtain and never got to get her ideas out. That may be partly true. I don't think that's the decisive factor. I think even if Poland had never been under an Iron Curtain, I don't think the Polish voice would have been heard. It's not the existence of the Polish voice that counts. It's how able Poles are to get their ideas to the general public, and they generally don't. Now, I'm not saying the Jews control the press. I am saying that Jews have a heck of a lot more access to the press and to influencing public opinion than Poles do, and this wouldn't have mattered whether Poland was under the Iron Curtain or not. Let's consider advertising. It doesn't matter you're advertising something to buy or something to be known. Okay, successful companies have found, this is a book about advertising, how to be heard in an overcrowded. It's not, reputation or image was more important as selling a product than any specific feature. That's the position that the product owns in the prospect's mind. So for Jews to talk about their suffering, the idea is to have create a reputation and an image that will stick in the public mind and which will gradually push out all other genocides. Now, so there's a brand, okay? Each product has a brand, which is why companies fight even in court to protect the brand from any kind of rivalry. And each brand is uniquely positioned to occupy a certain location in the mind of the prospect. So Jews started using the word Holocaust already in the 50s with a small h in front. I've reviewed some old books. I've seen this for myself. And then it became center stage. It became a brand. And so what do we have? We have, there's the Holocaust, and then there's all those other genocides. It's not a Xerox. It's a copier. It's not a genocide. It's the Holocaust. Okay, so one name can't stand for two distinctly different products. Xerox means copier, not computer. Okay, exactly right. That's why at the time the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum was built, Polish groups have suggested that the term Holocaust be expanded to include the Poles and other victims of Nazi Germany. The Jews would have nothing for it. They're smart. They knew what they were doing. They wanted to be a brand that has a unique position that refers to Jews and only the Jews. And because other genocides don't have brand names, it means they'll be at an immediate disadvantage. I mean, everybody can name Xerox as a copier. Who can name maybe Hewlett-Packard, maybe one or two other companies that make big copiers. Nobody else, because it has a unique position. Xerox means copier. It has a specific brand name and specific position in the mind. So it is with Holocaust. Now, there are other genocides. Some of them do have there's special brand names, but whoever heard of them, whoever heard of the Aget is the Armenian genocide. Whoever heard of the Faraimos, that's the Gypsy genocide. Nobody heard of them because they have no means of publicizing it. So Jews own the brand name Holocaust, and they reduce it, all the other genocides to trivialities, to add that. You have the Holocaust, and then you also have some other genocides. You have the Holocaust, and then there's also some of the other victims of the Nazis, okay? They have no brand name, they have no special recognition in the public imagination. And then people sometimes say, well, it doesn't matter how much publicity the Holocaust gets because it's not a zero-sum game. Every idea will make it into the marketplace. I mean, that's nonsense. The human mind is finite, okay? Once you've preoccupied some of the niches, it's very hard for another product to get a hearing. That's why in categories, year after, Hertz outsells Avis, General Motors outsells Ford, Goodyear outsells Firestone, and so on. Once a brand name has a special impact in the public mind, it's very hard to dislodge, and it's very hard to compete with. Again, the human mind is finite. Even if people could buy people are not going to buy every product, even if they could afford it. People buy the products that they hear about the most, they're advertised the most, or impressed by the most, and the rest they will forget. So it is with genocides. People will remember what they care about the most, the Holocaust, and then they will think very little or nothing of other genocides. Okay, then what to do about it? Well, in several hundred of my reviews, I use the term Jews Holocaust. No, I do it purposely because I want to reduce the association of the Holocaust with the Jews. It's a deliberate trademark dilution on my part. Now, if the Holocaust was a legal trademark, I'd be breaking the law and I could be sued for doing that because that would dilutes the impact of the trademark. Now, Holocaust would especially dilute the trademark of the Holocaust because it's an obvious takeoff of Holocaust. Any kind of imitation of a obvious imitation, or sometimes not obvious imitation of a trademark, the courts decide that is illegal and infringes on the right of the trademark owner. So the word Holocaust would be illegal. But again, because the Holocaust is not a legal trademark, I can legally do that and undermine the presumed significance of the Holocaust and bring some of the glory of the Holocaust onto the Poles and their suffering. Remind the world that the Poles did also. There was a Polish politician who had advocated the term Polokaust. He wanted to build a Holocaust museum, but 2 days later he recanted. I guess the Jews had a real fit and put him in his place. And he said he was sorry he hurt the Jews' feelings by using the term Polokaust. So there you have it. That's the kind of game. That's how jealously Jews guard the word Holocaust. They know what it means, and they know the advantages they get from having that term. Okay, next.
Now, Jan, in your analysis of the book by Julia von den Knezebeck, and the book's title is called The Roma Struggle for Compensation in Post-War Germany, you point out that the competition for the status of a victim is inevitable as long as there is a concerted effort to present the Holocaust as uniquely and exclusively deserving of the genocide label that dominates Western public consciousness. So describe for us the various factors involved that invalidate the Holocaust narrative's claim that it is irrefutably the ultimate genocide.
Okay, first of all, we have the idea of Jews kept floating around as Yehuda Bauer, a Holocaust scholar, the idea of unequal victims, that Poles and Jews were unequal victims. Before dealing with that, let's look what that means. Just because you have unequal victims does not mean that there should be unequal recognition or that the greater victims should get more attention and recognition. Look at people in wheelchairs, those who have just their legs paralyzed, the paraplegics, and those who have all four limbs paralyzed, the tetraplegics or quadriplegics. Clearly, they are unequal victims, but the tetraplegics do not get special attention or recognition or other favors or special rights compared to paraplegics. And tetraplegics do not look down on paraplegics as lesser victims the way Jews look down on Poles, okay? So just because, even if you have unequal victims and recognize it as such, it doesn't mean it should create an inequality of recognition. Now, I'm not one to praise the Soviet Union, but I have to this time give credit where credit is due. Soviet Jews began to stick their heads out and demand special attention and recognition for Soviet Jews as victims, and the Soviets said, no, do not divide the dead. There's 27 million Soviet citizens who died at the hands of Nazi Germany, and 1.5 million of these were Jews. So no, we do not divide the dead. We do not give Jews any special attention or recognition, and there should be no victim hierarchies of any kind. Hate to say this, but bravo, Soviets. Now, once we start, in fact, dividing the dead, it clearly becomes an arbitrary meritocracy of who gets more recognition. What kind of hierarchy do we create? Jews, of course, claim that they were the only people who were targeted for total annihilation. And for this reason, they should win the victim trophy and that they are unique. First of all, 11 million European Jews mentioned in Wannsee. Again, only 6 million were killed. 6 out of 11 million. That's hardly a complete genocide. And even those accessible to Germany, 2 million Jews within access of Nazi Germany were still left alive. But apart from all that, just some Gypsies and Armenians also have gotten in the act of victim competition. Their groups were also subject to total annihilation. And Jews argue no, because not every Gypsy was actually killed by Hitler, and not every Armenian was killed by the Turks. But of course, that's self-refuting, because not every Jew, far from it, within range of Hitler was killed by Hitler. Okay, so that fails. Then if we start dividing the dead, we could have a meritocracy. 36 million Chinese murdered by Mao Zedong is more important than 6 million Jews killed by Hitler. Far more. So the Chinese should win the victim trophy and get all the attention and recognition, classrooms by politicians and everybody else. Then you could also consider who suffered more. How do you measure it? The Jew who died from German bullets or German gas within a few minutes, or the Ukrainian who died in Stalin's Holodomor, starved to death in agony over weeks and months. So we could say that the Ukrainians suffered more than the Jews, so the Ukrainians should get the victim trophy. Then there's the matter of who was first. The first well-known 20th century genocide was of the Armenians. So following the logic of victim competition, Armenians should get first place and get all the attention and recognition, and push the Jews off their perches, and so on. Next.
So as part of its efforts to reinforce the assertion that Hitler's genocide of European Jews was the most tragic genocide in history, the Holocaust Supremacy camp employs a number of rhetorical devices. So if you would describe for us some of the main emotional arguments that are used to support this fictitious assertion.
Okay, this is kind of a difficult, perhaps controversial topic, because it goes back in history, goes far back in history. There was a time in Jewish writings like the Talmud and the Jewish mysticism, Kabbalah, some of those traditions had it that the Goyim were inferior and were almost animals compared with the Jews. But that's old stuff. Nobody believes that anymore. They haven't for centuries. Well, not quite. Holocaust scholar Barbara Engelking gets a lot of praise from the Holocaust establishment because of her lies and slander of Poles. She actually revived this kind of a primitive Jewish racism, and she said, death for Poles was simply a biological natural matter. And for Jews, it was a tragedy. It was a dramatic experience. It was metaphysics. Oh, really? So in other words, only Jews are fully human. Only humans experience tragedy. A cow going through slaughter, as far as we know, does not experience tragedy. An earthworm picked out by a robin does not experience a tragedy. Only humans experience tragedy. So really only Jews are humans. Only they experience. For Poles, it's no different from an earthworm dying or a cow dying. That's pretty strong, but that's exactly what it is. Now, I've read a lot of Holocaust books, and I've reviewed them. What Barbara Engelking said is actually very common. It's not put in such a direct racist way, but it's put in other indirect ways that say pretty much the same thing. Lots of times I hear the Holocaust is the greatest crime in history. Wow, who determined that? When did the human race get to vote on them? And of course, close to it, the Holocaust is the universal symbol of evil. Wow, what is that? What are they saying? In other words, a crime against the Goy can never be as severe, as bad, or as evil as a crime against a Jew. So it's like in the Talmud, hitting a Jew is like hitting God. Okay, so Jews are above everybody, and a crime against them is always greater than a crime against non-Jews. Some Germans even get fancier. They say the Holocaust was a Zivilisationsbruch, a break in civilization. Oh, wow. So only the Jews' Holocaust was important enough to have caused a rupture in civilization. A genocidal crime against the Goy can never be severe enough to cause a break in civilization. Then you have softer ways of saying almost the same thing. The Holocaust is beyond rational understanding. So in other words, a crime against the Jew is beyond rational understanding. But a crime against the Goyim certainly is a common event. It's well within rational understanding. So you see these racist statements, how they add up and what they say. Now, we also hear constantly for teaching about the Holocaust, we must fight anti-Semitism. And it's the world's oldest hatred. First of all, that itself is a form of racist presumption. We do not know how old different hatreds, how far back they go. This business of fighting Semitism, I know I've been following this stuff for 40 years. Jews are always saying that there's anti-Semitism, so we must constantly keep the Holocaust in mind. Now, in recent years, there has actually been an increase in anti-Semitism. It appears to be anyway, and the Jews are complaining that nobody's listening, nobody's doing anything about it. Well, maybe it's like the boy who cried wolf. All this times they have cried wolf about anti-Semitism, and now finally a real wolf has come. Nobody's doing anything about it. Maybe there's something to think about. Then, of course, all this business nowadays of diversity and tolerance and all that Holocaust, they'll talk about it to promote tolerance. Oh my goodness. You could teach the Cambodian genocide to promote tolerance. You could teach the Polish genocide, the Polokaust to promote tolerance. Better yet, teach all genocides in order to promote tolerance. Ironic to that, Holocaust supremacy is itself a form of intolerance, such as these racist statements that I've quoted above. And it's an act of intolerance toward other genocides by giving them lesser attention, lesser coverage, or no attention or no coverage at all. Okay, next.
To maintain its self-appointed position as the preeminent victims of Nazism, the Holocaust supremacy camp employs a number of rhetorical devices to negate and cancel Hitler's genocide of Poles. So if you would describe for us some of the devices used to downplay and diminish the suffering of the Poles.
Okay. First of all, there's a range of estimates how many Poles were actually murdered by the Germans. Holocaust museums tend to cite only the lowest figure, 1.9 million, can actually be considerably graded. In this way, they're like the Holocaust deniers. Now, the Holocaust deniers, technically speaking, are not Holocaust deniers. They're not saying that the Nazis didn't kill any Jews. They're saying Nazis killed maybe 20 times fewer Jews. See, 300,000 instead of 6 million. So in a way, Holocaust museums are doing just like the Holocaust minimizers by minimizing Polish suffering. The most insulting out of all, when I hear lots of times in publication, Jews say, after all, only 10% of Poles died against 90% of Poles. Only 10%. Huh, that's insulting. That's like saying, the Holocaust stopped Jews, stop talking about it. That was only 1/3 of the Jewish population. That's nothing, equally insulting. And there's several layers of fallacy in this kind of thinking. First, it's an historical accident that it happened and the Jews get no credit for it. Okay, 90% of Polish Jews. You could also cite lower figures, like in France, Jews, Belgian Jews, about 40 or 50% died, even then. Then you have 2/3 of the world's population didn't suffer any losses because they were out of range of Nazi Germany. So it's 10% of Poles died against 0% of American Jews. Or it's 10% of Poles died against 0% of Argentinian Jews, and so on. Then it's also false equivalent. You know the old saying, this 10%, 90%, the old saying, figures don't lie, but liars figure. And that's exactly what's being done here by the Jews. Because, first of all, they're not equal. Poland's Jews were very easy for the Nazis to kill because the Jews lived in segregated neighborhoods, which the Germans made into ghettos. It was very simple to round the Jews up, put them on the trains, the death camp, which the Judenrat and the Jewish ghetto police did most of the dirty work. So it was trivially simple for the Germans to kill 90% of Polish Jews against only 10% of Poles. It just took a few months, the latter half of 1942, for the Germans to wipe out the vast majority of Polish Jews and do it very easily with very little effort in this way. Finally, it is a matter of timing. The first 2 years of the German occupation, the Germans actually killed more Poles than they killed Jews. So if the war ended right there 2 years later, but before the end of 1941, you would have had maybe 5% of Poles died against 3% of Polish Jews. And in history, the Nazis would go down as the bigger killers of Poles than of Jews. On the other hand, the war lasted much longer than it did. You'd have a heck of a lot more than 10% of Polish Jews, maybe 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, or maybe 90% of Poles would die against, compared with 90% of Polish Jews, the rest of the Jews being mostly out of reach and in the Soviet Union. Then an insulting lie which the Jews make is to say, Jews died because they were Jews, while Poles died because it was war. Pure baloney. Because the vast majority of Poles died from genocide. They did not die because of combat, because it was war. Bombs were flying, bullets were flying, shells were being lobbed into cities. No, the vast majority of Poles did not die from any kind of military action. They died because they were deliberately murdered, just as the Jews were deliberately murdered. Then auxiliary for Germans. Nazi Germans killed Poles only for breaking German rules, while they killed Jews for no reason at all. Tell that to those Poles who were innocently murdered, Poles who were leaving a marketplace. Suddenly, the Germans surrounded them indiscriminately by age, by sex, by age, and they took them on their side and they shot them all. Grad Łapanka, the catching, where Germans would suddenly round up a crowd of Poles and take them all to the concentration camp or take them somewhere to be shot. So this Nazi Germans go only for breaking German rules. That is a travesty of justice and is a flat lie. Okay, now, Jews also say the killing of Jews was an end in itself, while the killing of Poles was for a purpose. Nonsense. All genocides have a purpose, which includes the collective targeting. That's what makes it a genocide. You collectively target a whole group. It doesn't matter what the individual did or did not do. The whole group is targeted, and there's always some purpose for it. Okay, so specifically, Jews and Poles were collective embodiments of something in the German mind. Jews were all a collective embodiment of the international Jewish power that ruled the Allies to go to war against Germany, and which drove the war effort against Germany, and which profited from Germans dying from Allied bombings, while the Germans were making money from the Jews were making money from the Germans dying from the bombing. Okay, so Jews were an embodiment of that, and they were punished accordingly. Poles, on the other hand, were an embodiment of a people who do not have their own culture. It's not copy German culture. They don't want to submit to German rule, and they don't want to give their territories for the Germans to steal. They're an embodiment of something. Again, it doesn't matter what the individual Jew did or what the individual Pole did. They're all targeted as a collective, as an embodiment of this. Now, finally, Jews make a great deal about Holocaust denial. They've been doing it for decades. Norman Finkelstein burst this bubble. He said, the Holocaust deniers are about as influential as the Flat Earth Society. They pose no threat, even when Holocaust denial is legal, they pose no threat whatsoever to Holocaust memory. They're totally fringe idea. So why do the Jews keep bringing it up? In order to beat the drum about the urgency of we must keep talking about the Holocaust, or it will be denied and forgotten. And they have expanded it to include Holocaust distortion for things that they don't agree with, they don't like. And then if you object, they complain that you have Holocaust envy. That's right. We should be envious. We should be envious of the Jews seizing all these privileges and becoming a special class of Americans. They get all these special rights that Polish Americans do not get. Poles should be envious of having their history stolen, being silenced, and being a marginalized people in large extent because of the Jews. Poles should be very much envious of that. Okay, keep going.
Now, you point out that there are very few Jewish scholars who disagree with or strongly criticize the argument that the Holocaust is the untouchable apex of a hierarchy of genocidal suffering. So please discuss one of these scholars and what his reasoning is.
Okay, Israel Charny is a Holocaust scholar. He died about a month ago. He's wrote a fascinating book. For a long time, he's attended Holocaust conferences and he observed the attitudes that Jews have towards it. And he was quite frank about it. He talked about the literal rage direct against anyone who has committed the worst sin of all by referring to the Armenian genocide or to any other genocide also as a Holocaust. Here you have the Holocaust brand name, how the Jews jealously guarded and only wanted to refer to themselves and nobody else, even if it's done in private. And then finally, he really spoke up against the Jewish chauvinism and kind of racist contempt for the sufferings of other people. He said about the Jews, when we deny, belittle, or are indifferent to the torture and killings of others in favor of promoting our own histories of suffering and being virtuous, it is as if we are saying we are unprecedented, incomparable, unique, and exclusive, superior, the ultimate people. Yeah, exactly right. That's what Holocaust supremacy is. It is a form of racism, and he made it very clear and unambiguous that that's exactly what it is. Okay, keep going. Okay, finally, let's consider about the injustice. Oh, I'm sorry, you wanted to say something. I'm sorry, I forgot.
Yeah, just real quick, we know that the genocides perpetrated against the Armenians, the Ukrainians of the Holodomor, the European Roma, in what they have named the Parajmos. More specifically, we know that Poles were subjected to genocide by Hitler, Stalin, and even the Ukrainian insurgent army. So now in one of your analyses, you point out that all victims of genocide must be treated freely and fully recognized. That recognition of one's genocide should be a basic civil right. So what do you see are the implications of the continued exclusion and marginalization of these genocides by the Holocaust narrative and by the media and popular literature that continually repeat it?
Okay. Holocaust supremacy is not only a form of racism, not only is unjust to other genocide, but it inflicts a second wound on other people who have experienced genocide. As this author, Trudy Gouvier, says, what is second wounding? The point of this expression is that silence about a person's wounds is itself a wound because wounded people need acknowledgement and attention. If their wounds are unseen and their stories unheard, their needs will be unmet. To be met, they must be acknowledged. In virtue of their suffering experience, victims merit deference and respect. Amen and amen. Just talking about these things about Holocaust supremacy is not going to change anything. I'd like to see an international policy that will condemns Holocaust supremacy as a form of racism. And I would like to see in the US for all Holocaust museums to be torn down and to replace by some of them by museums which feature all the victims of genocide on an equal footing. Let's put it this way. Roughly 100 million people were killed by genocide in the 20th century, of which 6 million were Jews. That's just 6%. I'd like the floor spaces of all these museums to give no more than 6% of the attention to Jews and the other 94% to the non-Jews who died in genocide. Okay. Next.
Now, we often see the Holocaust narrative's derisive statement, and you pointed it out before, that 90% of Poles, Jews, died at the hands of the Germans, while only 10% of ethnic Poles perished. thereby giving supposed credence to the claim of victimhood supremacy. So, in what ways were the Nazis limited in killing Poles, given the wartime conditions that existed?
Okay, several things. First of all, Hans Frank, in charge of occupation, but he wanted to starve 10 to 15 million Poles to death. After a model, again, the Nazis imitating the communists, the Holodomor in the Ukraine, millions of Ukrainians starved to death. Hans Frank complained he wasn't given the manpower to be able to do this. Now, when the Nazi Germany attacked the Soviet Union in June of 1941, they expected the Soviet Union to collapse within 3 to 6 months. At that time, they would starve, they would kill 30 million Slavs by starvation. But the USSR did not cooperate. She did not collapse then or at all. And so the Nazis did not have the manpower to starve millions. They did kill millions of Slavs in non-military methods, but they lacked the manpower to kill tens of millions of Slavs. Going back to sterilization, Himmler suggested that Poles be mass sterilized after the war was ended. The Germans were also reluctant to kill more Poles than they did for various reasons. First of all, too disruptive of wartime production. You have constant hustle and bustle beyond the front line. That's inconsistent with wartime production. In addition, Polish guerrilla warfare. The Germans knew if the Germans made a major force killing more Poles, there will be more Polish guerrilla warfare, which means that more German forces would be tied down and attempting to suppress the Polish guerrilla warfare. Then the Germans also reckoned with even as in the military sense, world opinion. If they could barely get away with killing a few million Jews, they certainly could not get away with killing tens of millions of Poles. And also fears of other European nations, what would be done to them if the Germans had crossed the line into killing tens of millions of people. Finally, the Germans had the same kind of quandary they had for Jews and Poles. Who do you kill and who do you keep alive to exploit? So the Germans could not kill many more Poles than they did because they needed a stable nation to exploit the farm stuff, the feedstuffs, everything like that. It has to be relatively stable and peaceful or you cannot exploit them. If there's constant disruption, constant guerrilla warfare, killings of Poles, you cannot collect a lot of feedstuffs, confiscate from the Poles and things like that. So that's a practical matter. Okay, next.
Okay, so this is involved a little bit. We have Nazi policies for the treatment of Jews and Poles. As you say, they often varied. And of course, this is why their fates often differed. So please explain these various Nazi policies, their differences, and why they resulted in different outcomes.
Okay, first of all, let's start with the bottom right. A lot of Jews say that Poles could redeem themselves by being Germanized. Well, of course, Jews couldn't do anything to redeem themselves in the eyes of the Nazis. That's false. Hitler said a Pole cannot become a German at all. He can't do it by speaking German or adopting German culture. They're racially different. So about 4%, a small amount of Poles were Germanized, but they were not really Poles. They were Germanized. They were Polonized Germans who became re-Germanized. It was not a favor to Poles. It was simply a recovery of German blood. True ethnic Poles could not Germanize themselves or redeem themselves in the eyes of the Germans any more than Jews could. Now, a lot of the differences between the treatments of Poles and Jews were cynical, probably on purpose. For example, the Germans allowed 669 calories daily for Poles, 184 calories daily for Jews. That's twice as much done for Poles, and really, but both are a tiny fraction of the German ration of 226.19 calories daily. And both the Polish rations and the Jewish rations are starvation rations. So it's a cynical difference because both were equally useless. They were starvation rations. In the Nazi system, Jews had 0% racial worth. Germans, of course, 100%. Poles only 15%. So the Polish racial worth, mainly because of the German blood they may have in them, was much closer to the Jewish value of 0 than to the German value of 100%. So functionally, A battery that's 85% discharged is almost essentially as useless as a battery that's 100% discharged. So for practical purposes, Poles and Jews were equivalent. Then a manner of treating forced laborers. The Germans paid Polish forced laborers something. They didn't pay the Jewish forced laborers nothing. But so what? The Germans had creative ways of confiscating, recouping the payments to Polish forced laborers by imposing various fees. So in practice, neither Poles nor Jews were paid. They were equal. Now, going up, you hear the Jews say they were put in ghettos and Poles were not. But that's a disingenuous comparison because Poles did agriculture. They had to move around in order to collect feedstuffs, to do farming, to deliver the quotas that the Germans were confiscating. It would have been suicidal, physically impossible to put Poles all in urban areas like in ghettos. Who'd do the farming? Who'd raise all the food for the Poles and for the Germans? Couldn't be done. So that's why Jews were put in ghettos and Poles were not. It wasn't some kind of a special favor to Poles that the Germans did and not to Jews. Then we have this nonsense that all Jews knew that they were doomed, while Poles had some hope of surviving. That's reading history backwards, and it's not the way it happened. Most Jews were in denial over the fact that they were dying. Most Thunder commandos report that the Jews went right to the gas chambers, and they had no idea, they thought they were going to take a shower. They had no idea that they were going to be killed. So it's certainly not true that the Jews knew that they were all. Poles, on the other hand, also thought they were going to be exterminated in some way, maybe even more so because Poles had a more negative view of the Germans than the Jews. So the Poles were more aware of the evils that the Germans are capable of than even the Jews did. Then, of course, there was much overlap between the way Poles and Jews were treated by the Germans. For example, Rassenschande, racial shame of a German having sexual relations with either a Jew or a Pole. The Jew got a death penalty for having sexual relations with a German, and the Pole also got the death penalty for sexual relations with a German. But it was okay for the Nazis if Poles and Jews had sexual relations with each other. Then let's top right, look at the concentration camps. There was no breakdown by nationality. Sometimes Poles were treated worse, sometimes Poles were treated better. It depends on the job that the people got in the camps. Sometimes Poles were treated better, sometimes Jews were treated better. Finally, nowadays we hear a lot, we shouldn't compare groups, we should look at individuals. Okay, let's play that game and use it against the Jews. Let's say not every single Jew was treated worse by the Nazis than every single Pole, and not every single Pole was treated by the Nazis better than every single Jew. So we should not, that's another reason why we should not have Holocaust supremacy. We should bury it once and for all. Next.
So many Poles conclude that the Jews have taken away Auschwitz from the Poles. How is this conclusion supported by the facts?
Okay, first of all, first 20 years, the Jews did not attach anything special to Auschwitz. Even there was Christian institutions in Auschwitz, and nobody objected. Now suddenly Jews want to make it a Jewish brand, and to like Holocaust as a brand, now Auschwitz is a Jewish brand. So Polish Jew history is erased, and it's worked. Outside of Poland, very few people know that Auschwitz was a place where Poles have died. So in this respect, Jews were successful in stealing Polish history and erasing Polish history. The Jews also made an effort to drive the Carmelite nuns and crosses to be removed from Auschwitz. That was chutzpah. If I was the Polish president, I would give the Jews some chutzpah of my own. I recount the Talmudic principle that if somebody so much as makes you change the color of your shoelaces, you should refuse to do it. So even if we consider this minor, I don't, but even if I did, I would not do it. If I was Polish president, I would take the initiative, take a trip to Auschwitz, personally plant a cross at Auschwitz, and I would sign a directive forbidding any and all interference with Christian and Polish institutions at Auschwitz. Now, of course, Jews justified by saying that in Birkenau itself, overwhelmingly Jewish victims. Birkenau crematories 850,000 Jews were gassed and cremated, and only 10,000 Poles. So, all right, that's better than 98%. Now, doesn't give the Jews any right, any more than Christians have a special right in this. If there was an airplane crash where 98% of the victims were Christian, it doesn't give Christians a right to own the place. It doesn't have a right to make it a private cemetery. It's still a place of common death. It's not a private Jewish cemetery. It's not a private Christian cemetery. It's everybody's memory must be respected. Christians don't have the special right to monopolize a place where 90% of the victims are Christians. Neither do Jews have a special right to monopolize a place where 98% of the victims were Jews. Then if you also do victimhood competition, it all depends on metrics, who has the power. If the Russians had the power and they wanted to do this, they could say, in Auschwitz-Birkenau itself, 99% of Auschwitz Russians died against 88% of Auschwitz Jews. So Jews get to own Auschwitz and get a right to dictate claims to other victims. Then also Jews say, well, Auschwitz is only one place. I mean, all those other places where Jews died, Jews didn't claim it. That's like saying, well, I only stole one item, so it's not. No, you have no right to steal even one item. It doesn't belong to you. Auschwitz does not belong to the Jews, and they have no right to steal it, even if it's the only one. Plus, it's disingenuous. The other death camps, Sobibor, Treblinka, Belzec, hell no, the Germans destroyed them. So there was nothing left there. So of course, it's disingenuous claim that Jews don't really try to own those places, because those places don't exist anymore. They can't have any significance. Now, Cardinal Glemp had suggested a compromise that Birkenau would belong to the Jews only, and Auschwitz proper would belong only to the Poles. But the Jews rejected because Jewish ashes cannot be divided. This itself has racist overtones. Jewish ashes are sacred. They can't be divided. But Polish ashes can be divided, even with Glemp's suggestion made it so. Okay, so we have another racist double standard. Now, guess what? When you make concessions, you just get more demands. And that's what happened. The Poles unilaterally gave the Jews what they wanted. And now the Jews are getting bolder. They're now calling some Jews are saying that Auschwitz should be disconnected from Poland and put under United Nations or international rule. Direct attack on Poland's sovereignty, attempt to take Polish territory away. Okay, finally, some Poles have really suggested how to return the chutzpah that the Jews have done about Auschwitz. Kick the Jews out of Auschwitz, use bulldozers to scrape the Birkenau soil, put it in barrels and take it to Israel. In Israel, the Jews can have their own Birkenau all to themselves in Israel from that stripped off soil, and leave the Poles alone to have Auschwitz for themselves. It's extreme, but it kind of gets the point across. One act of chutzpah provokes another act of chutzpah. Okay, next.
For the benefit of our viewers, this is the last slide. Another means by which Holocaust supremacism is expressed is the erection of memorials by Jews in places where both non-Jewish and Jewish victims were murdered, but their memorials only honor Jewish victims. Describe for us examples of this and why they are racist in nature.
Okay, all right. The Jews argue about Birkenau saying 98% of the victims were Jewish. Well, that doesn't even apply to Babi Yar. Babi Yar was a ravine near Kiev. The Germans shot 30,000 Jews, but they also shot 30,000 Ukrainians. So Jewish and non-Jewish are equal. No problem. The Jews have monopolized Babi Yar itself. Just like outside of Poland, Auschwitz is associated only with the Jews. Outside of Ukraine, Babi Yar is also remembered only in terms of the Jews. So Jews have stolen Ukrainian history just like they've stolen Polish history. At Babi Yar, there were already many memorials to all the victims, but the Jews didn't like that. They set up memorials only to themselves, in effect, snubbing them. And that's what they've done in other places too. Spilitowska Góra near Tarnów in Poland. The Germans shot both Poles and Jews at the same place. And the Poles set up a plaque to commemorate all the victims, Poles and Jews. The Jews didn't like that. They set up a plaque to only remember themselves. Okay, this is racist. It's like you have a group of white people coming to a table where blacks and whites are eating together, and the whites suddenly demand they want their own table where only white people can sit. So that's what the Jews were saying. They want to monopolize the place. They're saying a goy is not good enough to be commemorated alongside a Jew that was murdered. And this is even more egregious in terms of the Berlin Holocaust Memorial. It started, the Gypsies and other victims of Nazi Germany wanted a joint memorial to everybody, but the Jews raised a big stink and they said, no, it must be only to the Jews. And well, what about the other victims? Well, they can have their own monuments. So a separate monument was made to the Jews, and then the Gypsies, there should be another monument right next to it to the Gypsies. Oh, but the Jews wouldn't have that too. I guess a goy is not good enough to be commemorated alongside the Jew. And not only that, but a goy is not good enough to be commemorated even within a few 100 feet of the Jew. So finally, what happened? You have the Berlin Holocaust Memorial, the biggest one, predictably a much smaller one, hundreds of feet away to the Gypsies, another small one to the gays, and not at all to the Poles. There's our victim hierarchy. You have the Jews far in a class by themselves in the first place. Second place, you have the Gypsies. Third place, you have the gays. No place at all are the Poles. This has happened in other situations. To the American classroom, in Holocaust Memorial Day, there is increasing talk for inclusiveness. Well, Jews don't like inclusiveness when it fits them, but not when it doesn't fit their agendas. They said, no, you cannot commemorate any other genocide on Holocaust Memorial Day. They have their own days after, kind of like Father's Day. There's Father's Day. Like, well, you don't have to mention mothers on Father's Day because there's a separate Mother's Day and all that. But that's a nonsensical comparison. It's a lie, because Father's Day and Mother's Day are well established. They're on an equal footing with each other. Other genocide memorial days are not on an equal footing with Holocaust Memorial Day. So when Jews monopolize Holocaust Memorial Day and nobody else can be mentioned, those other victims will not be mentioned on their own days because they have minimal attention to the other days. Classrooms don't have the time to give equal time to the Jews, and equal time, a separate day for the Armenians, a separate day for the Poles, a separate day for the Gypsies, and all that. So Jews get to monopolize it that way by calling it the Father's Day lie. Okay, that's all, folks.
Okay, I'm going to do a stop share here. And so as we come to a close on our webinar, we at Posse EDU thank you for your interest and attendance. And Jan, thank you for sharing with us these important facts about the many ways in which the Holocaust narrative elevates the genocide of European Jews over all others and delegitimizes and belittles the genocide and suffering of the Poles.